Okay, good morning, everyone. Now, first of all, I would like to thank UNU and National Science Foundation in organizing the workshop, and it is my absolute pleasure to be here to tell you what we have learned in Australia in terms of the phytocap technology. Now, someone has been saying this morning about research is about applications. And I agree with that 100%, and hopefully after this workshop we can share some of the findings we have and make some good applications, especially in the region that we are participating here. Now, before I getting too excited to present what we learned in Australia in the past 5-6 years about phytocap, I would like to briefly just go through the concept of phytocap for the benefit of those people who haven't come across phytocap before, and especially for those people attending the workshop with a non-technical background. So I would like to ask the expert to bear with me a little bit on the introduction of phytocap. At the end, I would be trying to present my own interpretation of why phytocap could be an attractive option for developing country. In fact, in Australia, in US, it has been a relatively attractive option, but I would try to extend that to say that it would be an attractive option for developing country too. Okay. Now, Professor Yuen already covered the concept of land fillings. In the developing country, when we put waste in the ground, we usually implement a full containment system with the aim to prevent the contaminant, in this case, the landfill gas and leachate, polluting our environment. Now, for situation like the developing country, most highly likely that the waste disposed in the ground is in an open dump situation. If we are not talking about a new disposal site, with the waste already disposed in the ground, one of the best options in rectifying the situation would be to put in a final cover. Now, I listed 3 most important reasons of doing that. Hygienic reason is a very obvious reason. Apart from that, reducing the pollutant, that is in terms of the landfill gas and the odor, as well as controlling water getting into the waste and creating a lot of leachate. That would be something that we would like to aim for with the implementation of a phyto cover or any final cover. Now, before I move on to talk about phyto cover, I would like to just again briefly mention about what we are currently doing in terms of putting on the final cover conventionally. Now, typically, we try to put in a impermeable barrier to gas and water. So, landfill gas cannot get out easily, and rainwater cannot get into the waste easily. Now, this is a method that conventionally used in the developed country. In Australia, we are doing it all the time. The problem with that is if we are going to transfer that into developing country, it may have a little bit of problem because, as you can see here, we need relatively high quality control to ensure the impermeable barrier actually work. And the same problem in many countries, that is, if we want to have a impermeable barrier, we need to have the proper soil. Usually we have a compacted clay layer, and in some region, getting clay is very difficult. And if you have transport clay 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers away, it's becoming very expensive. Now the last stop point is really the main driver of phytocap in the developed country like Australia. Because after we compacted the clay, being clay, when it's subject to wetting and drying over the seasons, it actually swells and strengthens, and it changes in volume. Now because of that, with time, cracks developed. Now with the cracks developed, we will have the impermeable barrier becoming less effective. I try to show you a few diagrams here. That is just a diagram, making the point that if we are going to do the conventional compacted clay barrier, we need some machinery to do it. Now in the developing country, apart from some of the capital city, getting those heavy machinery could be a problem. I mentioned before, quality control is very important for this type of impermeable barrier, because we have to make sure the soil is properly compacted and it can achieve the very low permeability that we are designing. Again, that may be a bit of a problem in terms of having it in developing countries. Now this is a finished picture of a landfill in Melbourne. You can see the grass is quite dry because it's taken in summer. Usually, we just put a shallow-rooted grass, pasture grass on top, and we will leave it as open space. At least in Australia, we don't usually build houses on top because it sounds to me is a relatively crazy things to do, building on landfill, because it's sink and you may get landfill gas out of the cap. Now here is a cross section, just giving you some idea how a conventional compacted clay final cap look like. Here we have two passes of the compacted clay layer, and on top we put topsoil to sustain the surface vegetation. Now this diagram may not show very clearly on the screen because it's getting a bit dark, but on your print you will be able to see. It is very obvious that in this example at least, cracks develop in the clay, because when it's subject to drying and wetting, it changes in volume and cracks develop. Now this example is for compacted clay sitting under the sun for only 6 months. And if you are aiming for impermeable barrier, I would suggest to you this is not a very good impermeable barrier. And as a matter of fact, it is one of the main drivers for us to move into alternative landfill cover system. Now on the contrary, phytocap is not based on impermeable barrier concept. It's based on what we call a water balance concept. Yeah, okay. Basically what we have is in a phytocap, we relied on the soil layer to store water together with the plant or the vegetation to take away the water through evapotranspiration. Now in some countries like the US, they actually call it evapotranspiration cover for the same reason. I actually put in the word sponge and pump because the soil actually taking up the water like a sponge, and the plant actually pump the water away like a pump here. Now, one thing we actually learned just in the past few years, that because of the porous nature of the soil, it is not a permeable barrier, so it is a lot more porous than the clay, compacted clay layer. It actually can enhance microbial methane oxidation in terms of oxidizing methane gases. And in our case in Australia, we are actively doing it in terms of reducing greenhouse gas. And in Australia, it is a very big driver in terms of having phytocaps. Now, phytocap, as I said before, relies on water balance. When rains fall on top of the cap, some of the rain will run away, and some of the rain fall on will be taken away from evapotranspiration. What is left will go into the soil layer. Now, the storage of the layer will have a limited capacity. Once it reaches its upper storage capacity, water will drain. Now, for phytocap, we relied on that principle, but emphasizing on two things. One is the plant. Usually, we have very deep-rooted vegetation, which I will show you in some pictures later. And we also relied on the storage of the soil. Typically, a phytocap will have a much thicker layer than a conventional compacted clay cover. So by having a very strong component in evapotranspiration and a very good storage capacity, we are aiming for very little water getting through the surface into the waste. Now, this is the fundamental concept of phytocap. Now, as I mentioned before, phytocap is usually a little bit thicker. In this example we conducted in Melbourne, we have a relatively diverse plant population, grass, shrubs, and trees, and they all selected with the aim of performing the evapotranspiration effectively. Here's another diagram. I hope you can see it. Out of the 1.5 meter thick of soil layer, we put on the vegetation. This is a photo taken only after 2.5 years. If you have selected the right vegetation, you can see in this example, for the entire 1.5 meter thick of soil is fully occupied by roots. Now, from our experience, soil storage is only part of the equation. The major element making phytocap work is the vegetation. So selecting the vegetation is really a very important process. This shows you some of the phytocap plot that we have put on in the site, as compared to, on the left-hand side, the conventional cover with very shallow rooted grasses. Now, we have a site called Woolert Landfill in Victoria, which is about 40 kilometers north of Melbourne. They are the first site in Australia to have full implementation of phytocap in their landfill. As you can see here, the plant is being established for that landfill cell. Now, just giving you an update of what actually we have achieved in terms of using phytocap for containing waste disposal sites. In US, they started what we call the A-ACAP program in the early 2001, and they run for 5 years. After that, in Australia, we carry on with similar study we call the Australian A-ACAP program, running starting from 2006 to 2011. I will have some example to show you that some of the interesting findings that we have captured from the Australian study a little bit later. But the current situation in the US is, as you can see, 167 landfill is already having phytocap. So we cannot say phytocap is a brand new technology. It is not. In fact, it has been proven. And in Australia, we are a little bit behind US because we implement our program a little bit after the US A-ACAP program. We, in 2011, the Waste Management Association of Australia produced, because of the 5-year studies, a guidelines document. And now we will have round about, I would like to think the number is increasing, but currently about 12 landfill in Australia is having phytocap implemented. Now, I also mentioned a little bit earlier on about the ability of phytocap in oxidizing methane emitting from landfill to reduce greenhouse. Now, again, I will be showing you some of the findings that we have from the Australian study. As far as I'm concerned, it is very convincing that it is a much superior landfill cover than the conventional cover type. Now, the A-ACAP, that is what we call the Australian Alternative Cover Assessment Program, commenced in 2006 and finishing in 5 years in 2011. The aim of the project is relatively simple. We try to compare phytocap with the conventional cap for two things. The first thing is to look at how the phytocap perform in terms of limiting water getting into the waste. Now, we want to do that across the whole country to look at a range of climatic conditions. So obviously, you may say it may work better in a drier region, but for the wetter region, it may not work so well. But we are all about scientific research, so we actually go on to look to test a range of climatic conditions. The second objective is to try to look into the oxidation potential of phytocap compared to conventional cover again. Here are the industry partners represented by Waste Management Association. In fact, we have all the 5 states EPA involved in the program. It is a national program, about 7 universities involved in the program. It involves not just engineers like myself, we have plant ecologists, botanists, hydrologists, and other people from different disciplines involved in this program. Now, as I said before, it is a national program, and we went out to test a range of climatic conditions. This is the contour or the color representing how wet that place in Australia is. And we have tropical landfill in Townsville. We have relatively wet site in Lismore, that is a little bit above Sydney. A site in Melbourne, a site in Adelaide, and a site in Perth. Now, in this table, you will be able to see the numbers a lot clearer. The 5 test sites, the ownership of the site, some belong to local government, some belong to private operators. The rainfall intensity long-term average. range from the driest, only half a meter, to the wettest in Lisbon, about just under 1.5 meters. The other indication of the phytocap climate condition is what we call the potential evapotranspiration. We will have some very high, one in tropical Queensland, as compared to the other one in Adelaide. Now, this ratio, the potential evapotranspiration to rainfall ratio, will give you some indication of the range of the climate condition that we have investigated. So, after the study, we would like to tell people it may work also in the wetter region, because in the dry region, intuition will tell us it may work better. But let's see the result. Now, what we have done here is, for the test cell, every site, we have instrumentation to capture the data that we want for the comparison. Remember, we have two objectives. The first objective is to compare how much water getting through the cap for the clay cap and the phytocap. The second objective is to see how much methane emission and how methane can be best oxidized in the cap. And this is something we are using here for the test cell. Now, each of the test cell fully instrumented is about 10 meter times 20 meter in dimension on plan. We have a lasimeter in one of the pair of the cell. One is the clay cap, one pair for phytocap. And for the lasimeter, we actually have a layer of impermeable plastic, 2 mm HDPE or geomembrane. So we will have that pan to collect every single drop of water getting through the cap. So we will be able to compare the performance for the clay cap and the phytocap. The second objective is to measure how much emission going through the cap. So we have the control. Basically, we have the cell sitting on top of landfill, active landfill, and it will have direct contact with the waste, and gas would be coming out from the waste beneath it. So this is the design concept. What I would like to show you is a few diagrams about what we have done in the site in Melbourne, which is the Sitter Taylor's Road landfill. Now, this is a very big landfill complex. It's about 70 hectares. The circle here indicated the test cell. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, and the number 4 is being constructed. The date indicated here is from about the end of 2006. About the climate for this cell, for this site is, we have the potential evapotranspiration very high in the summer month. Remember, Melbourne is different from the northern hemisphere. We would have summer while you're having winter. So the summer months, we have very high evapotranspiration, and in the winter month, it's the opposite. Now in Melbourne, you can see the rainfall intensity is relatively constant over the year, a little bit more in the winter month. Now the challenge here for the designer of the phytocap is for two elements here. One is, in the very dry summer month, how can you pick up some plants that can survive the very dry summer? Basically, the soil moisture content will be very, very low. But in the winter month, you will have surplus of water that the soil can store. So you would like to hope that the vegetation can pump water actively during that period. So these are the main challenges. Unfortunately, for the site, the soil is not very ideal. It is a sandy soil. Sandy soil means if you put water through it, it will drain very rapidly. So basically, it has a very strong storage capacity. Working with the site operator, we have identified another option, that is, you may not be able to see it very clearly here, that is, the site actually produces some green waste compost, which is a byproduct when the waste come in and they compost the green waste. The problem with that byproduct is it is not of very high quality. If you want to sell compost in Australia, commercially, you have to meet the Australian standard. And this product, it doesn't meet Australian standard because of the sorting of the waste. So we make a decision to blend the two. We have the soil, and then we have the compost mixed together in a portion of 5:1 by mass. Now that would actually enhance the storage capacity of the soil, with the compost. And you would like to think that the plant will love it because of the compost there. Plant selection, we have a mixture of grasses, shrubs, and trees. Now my colleagues from the School of Botany is not here, so I will not be able to tell you too much about them, but all I can tell you is we have a selection of trees, shrubs, and grasses for the trial. This diagram shows you what we call the lasimeter, a big plastic impermeable pan to collect the percolation through the cap. So basically we know every single drop of water, and we will be able to measure how much volume getting through. And this is a drain hole, and we put a layer of drainage layer that all the water getting through will be drained rapidly to the hole before the plant actually taking it up. Mixing the soil with the compost on site. Now we, as I said before, measure a lot of data using instrumentation put in the test cell. These are the list. Because I'm running a bit of time, so I try to go through it a little bit quicker. One of the more important things we measure is the soil moisture content, because we would know the variation of the soil moisture content over the season, wet season and dry season, which I will show you some results later. So the percolation will come into a device called tipping bucket, and it is a very precise measurement of the flow, because every time it receives a certain amount, it will tip over. And we count the number of tips electronically, and we will know precisely how much water getting through. This is before the planting of vegetation, and we have a channel to collect runoff. So we would be able to round off the water balance exercise, knowing exactly what happened in the cap. Runoff come in to a pit, and we have a flow meter to measure how much water running off the surface. And everything is captured in a logger, and in fact the data is sent to the university via a modem. Also we have a weather station, capture all the important weather information relative to evapotranspiration. Now, as I said, the project commenced around about middle of 2006. And the test cell for Melbourne completed in around about middle of 2007, because there was a lot of instrumentation to put in. Now, this is the picture taken in December 2008, just about a year and a half. Now, you can see, because they are native vegetation that we have selected, the first year they do not grow very well. They take a long time to establish, being a native vegetation. Another 12 months, February 2010, you can see the vegetation is establishing. 2011, it almost becoming a native forest. That is round about 3.5 years after we plant the vegetation. Okay, I would like to share that with you. I mean, I try not to get into too technical, but one thing I would like to do is to compare the Melbourne site to the Townsville site, which is a very wet site. Now, some people may have the conception that phytocap may not work very well in the wet climate, but I was surprised when I see the results from Townsville. Okay, let's go back to Melbourne first. Here I have the cumulative rainfall on the left-hand side, cumulative runoff, cumulative natural flow, and drainage. Drainage means how much water getting through. So rainfall, runoff, drainage, they are cumulative over the time. Soil moisture content here. Again, it doesn't show very well here, but you can read it from your graph here. Basically, what we have is, because of the relatively consistent rainfall, the gradient is pretty steady here, cumulative. 1, 2, 3, 4 years later. What we are interested in is, obviously, how much water getting through as drainage. And that is the line here. In the first year, we would have picked up a fair bit of drainage because the vegetation has not established yet. But into the second year, with the establishment of the vegetation, even we have a little bit more rainfall in the second half of the study period. As you can see, the steeper gradient of the cumulative rainfall curve. We have very little increase in the cumulative drainage. So it shows you once the vegetation is established, it actually works quite well. Now, the other side is the extreme, that is for Townsville. The same thing, cumulative runoff, cumulative rainfall, runoff, drainage, and soil moisture content. Here we have the rainfall all happening in 1 or 2 months of the year. It's tropical. You can see the jump in rainfall in that year, December 2008, is more than 2 meters. Now the long-term averages is about 1 meter per year. But this year, it has been exceptional wet year, 2 meters. And the subsequent years is also a very wet year, close to 2 meters. The first year, we're looking at the drainage. We have an increase in drainage, subsequent to the rainfall. But after the establishment of the vegetation, you can see we have a bit of increase in the drainage, responding to the wet season, but it has been reduced substantially because of the vegetation. Now, when I look at the graph myself, I was very surprised because we would like to think in the size of around about 2 meter rainfall, phytocap may not work. Now, it depends on your criteria of whether it is working or not. As far as I'm concerned, that little bit of water getting into it, I think it worked really well. This chart, which I don't have too much time to go through, I will leave it to read about it, and it tells you, the summary of all the information we have collected for the Thai site. Plant survival rate. One thing we find from a study is trees, shrubs, and grasses. The trees survive the best in our site, at least. In fact, some of the grasses doesn't grow really well. We also look at the performance of the plant in terms of above ground and below ground, measuring the root development. And as I showed you earlier in the picture, this is a picture taken about 2.5 years after we plant the vegetation. The key here is if we have picked the right vegetation, it will work really well because of the very dense root system. We also look into the change in the soil density, how it affects the root development. Here's a table, again very briefly because I'm running out of time. I have a list of different plants, different columns of increasing compaction, increasing of density of the soil, from 72% of standard maximum dry density to about 87%. Now the blue box means the worst performing scenario for that plant. The yellow is the best performance in terms of how much root actually has grown. Now it actually indicated to us the best density would be around about the 80% maximum dry density region. So it cannot be too dense, it cannot be too light, the density. The same thing, we try to look at the effect of density on the uptake of water. Remember, uptake of water is important for our phytocap to function. The same thing here for this plant. For the better performance is, again, which is not surprising because it's closely relating to the root system. It functions the best at about 80% when we have that type of soil density. Now I would like to spend a little bit more time here on looking at the effect of the phytocap to oxidize methane, reduce greenhouse emission. We have device called flux chambers sitting on the surface of the cap. The concept is if we measure the change in concentration of the gas inside the chamber over time, we would be able to interpret the emission rate. We also insert gas probe at different depth inside the soil and take soil sample to measure the gas concentration to look at the efficiency of methane oxidation. In the greenhouse, we try to establish some interrelationship between how landfill gas affect the plant growth with increasing concentration, and we also want to look at how the plant would change the structure of the soil in terms of promoting methane oxidation. Now this graph may look complicated, but if I can get the organizer to give me another 5 minutes, I can go on to explain a little bit more about the graph. Could I just go on a little bit for another 5 minutes? Maybe about 2-3 minutes. Okay. Now here I have a graph suggesting nitrogen in the graph for a conventional clay cover, and the percentage or ppm of methane concentration. Now this is ppm in log scale. You compare this to the next one, phytocap, the difference is very obvious. First, you have air diffused almost through the entire cap because of the more porous nature. And because of the availability of oxygen, the concentration of methane is almost minimal here, especially at the top. We're talking about here about 20-30 ppm. In terms of emission, we have, out of the number of emissions that we have conducted, 65% in the conventional clay cover detect some emission. but only 70% in the phytocap have emission detected. But out of the 17% detected, they are very low as compared to the high emission rate in the conventional clay cover. Now, because I'm running a little bit out of time, what I would like to do is just highlighting one or two points here about why, personally, I would like to say phytocap could be an attractive option for developing countries, especially if we are looking at capping existing dumping sites. We need not a lot of technical skill, but if we are going to put the soil on top, maybe a lot of labor. Instead of having heavy machinery, we can overcome that by doing some laboring work here. It would be cost effective because we're using locally available resources. I think we can have a lot to learn from what we have been doing in the US and in the Australia context. I personally think if we are going to implement phytocap in another country, it would be good to have a pilot study. For example, to identify the suitable plant for that region, which is the most important element. Now, I put on a lot of benefit here, which you can read it for yourself, which is self-explanatory. But one thing I would like to highlight is it can apply to new disposal site that is in Australia, in the US, but in the developing country context, it is more particularly relevant to the existing dump site, which we usually do not have that luxury to retrospectively install liner. So I'm sorry I overrun a little bit with time, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer questions from the floor.
So what about low rainfall area?
Please, please.
Is it suitable for
And in fact, the question here is for low rainfall area, less than 200 mm. In fact, I thought Australia is dry. Where you come from is dry. Now, 200 mm in my terminology is close to a desert. As far as I understand, if you are landfilling in a desert, you are not too worried about water getting into the ground, I would like to say.
I'm talking about methane oxidation.
Yeah, the methane natural gas, yeah. I would like to think you can have better method to look after the methane. If you are looking at in the desert environment, 200 mm, unless I have something differently telling me from my colleagues from the School of Botany, I would like to think it may not be a very ideal situation for phytocap. Now, by the way, I'm not here to say to everyone, phytocap is good for everywhere, every country. I'm not saying this. I'm not suggesting this at all. But I'm trying to put forward the idea to everyone that it could be a potential alternative to what you are already using with a cost-effective and less engineering demanding nature.